Because Your People Matter. A playbook for managers, entrepreneurs and leaders. Written and read by John Berry and Sue Berry. First published in hardback edition in December 2018. Second edition published in paperback and ebook in August 2020. Both published by Grosvenor House, Tolworth, UK. This third edition was recorded as 12 chapters in autumn 2022 and is available on YouTube. Chapter 5. Managing People. 5.1 Introduction. Few managers learn their trade in any formal sense. Most learn on the job by trial and error without engaging with the theories of management science. We aim to correct this absence of formal learning by providing here just enough theory to be useful, but not so much that managers dump the theory and return to the dark side. We aim to provide theory as a means to learning itself. Managers need to be able to understand what to do case by case, but inferring that what worked last time will work this time is fundamentally flawed. No manager can experience enough instances of each type of management situation to give them anything like the generalizations to apply when faced with a new event. But academics can. Academics spend their lives experiencing thousands of situations by postulating hypotheses and gathering evidence. And they develop theories that help managers understand what they should do. Models are another form of generalization. Models embrace one or more theory. We use several academic theories here and have developed and set out a number of models. Managers should use these models day by day. 5.2 Performance. 5.2.1 Feedback-Driven Management. Probably the most useful model for managers is the feedback control loop. The manager is constantly sensing performance given by their people. They have in mind a reference performance that they'd find acceptable, and they are constantly comparing the actual performance with the reference. If the performance falls below the reference performance, the manager will act by way of an intervention. The idea is shown in Figure 5.1. We use the same model in discussing leadership in Chapter 2. 5.2.2 Performance Dependencies. In order to determine what to do about performance variance or non-conformity with the reference performance, the manager must know on what performance depends. It's in those dependencies that the manager is going to intervene. Performance is dependent on many variables that must work together. There's a lot going on in a job holder's life, and it's the manager's job to ensure that the job holder is committed, motivated, and engaged. In the direct feed-forward path, we show that the person's job motivates them. That motivation causes behaviour, which in turn causes performance. Performance causes outcomes. The model is shown in Figure 5.2. We use a simplified version of this model in Chapter 2 on leadership. The model shows the 5 feed-forward concepts of job, motivation, behaviour, performance, and outcomes. Whether the job motivates depends on whether the job gives the job holder variety and whether the job holder sees the job as having significance. Motivation also depends on whether the job holder identifies with the work and is given the autonomy to get on and do the job as they see fit. And the job will motivate if the job holder gets immediate feedback about how well they're doing. If these attributes are missing, motivation won't happen. The manager has control of these 5 job characteristics and can redesign the job as needed to improve job motivation. Chapter 2 described how leadership influences motivation, and this is repeated in Figure 5.2. The culture in which the job holder works enables or constrains their motivation, and this too is shown in the figure. Whilst the biggest motivation a person has comes from their job, they will only be motivated if the job itself is in congruence with their own personal implicit or internal motives. If they've always wanted to be a doctor and they become one, it's likely that they'll be motivated. If they've always wanted to be a doctor and now they're a bus driver, that incongruence will work against other positive influences on motivation. Many managers try to tap the employee's explicit or external motives by offering bonuses and commission as incentives. Unfortunately, this is misplaced. Explicit motives are better tapped with things like recognition and promotion. Regardless of exactly what is used, though, tapping explicit motives is one area of influence available to the manager to enable motivation. Personality also plays a big part in motivation. Someone who is extroversive is likely to be keen to interact with people at work. But if the work precludes that social interaction, they'll likely be demotivated. Likewise, someone who is naturally not open to new ideas will find it difficult to get excited when asked to be creative. And finally, in considering motivation, if the job holder does not feel that they can perform, they won't. Development to achieve the right level of mastery will be needed to change that opinion. But development will also likely only work if the job holder has a strong need for growth. If their need for growth is low, the manager had better tap other variables and maybe accept that in this job and for this job holder, the performance desired is just not going to be realized. The link from job to motivation is not the whole story. People can be motivated, but somehow just not turn that motivation into performance. For performance, the person must exhibit necessary behaviors. And that depends on whether they have learned the necessary personal performance tools and habitual behaviors. For example, if we'd never learned to concentrate on a task, this book would never have been written. Likewise, the job holder needs self-efficacy, the knowledge that they can try, and that striving will lead to success. Managers might then intervene to boost self-efficacy through persuasion. But such action will likely be of limited effect, since this variable is substantially inherited and dependent on upbringing and early experience. Behaviour is also degraded if the employee feels that they're not in control of their own destiny. Those with an internal locus of control feel that they're in charge of what they do and hence they can perform. Those with an external locus of control feel that regardless of what they do, they will not be allowed to perform. They feel that external factors will control their efforts. In a similar sense, self-esteem describes how an employee feels about themselves. Low self-esteem will thwart behaviour. Managers can help build self-esteem by giving employees good work experience and recognition. As we noted above, if all other things are equal, the job done motivates, and this motivation causes behaviour. But behaviour only realises performance if the job holder has the wherewithal to do the job. They need skills and knowledge to be able to do what's needed. Experience builds confidence and the ability to know what performance looks like. And adequate intelligence, called general mental ability or G, helps the job holder learn new tasks and apply difficult concepts like quality in work done. Whilst we've discussed personality above as an influencer on motivation, one aspect of personality, conscientiousness, also plays directly on performance. Conscientiousness is the trait that drives the job holder to get stuck in and finish what they started. Conscientiousness is mostly inherited and learned in childhood and hence is substantially unchangeable. 5.2.3 Personal Characteristics. It's clear here that some variables like leadership are under the manager's control. Others, like employee intelligence, are not. The manager can influence variables like skills by implementing a personal development plan. Whether that is right to do depends much on the scale of the deficiency and the cost. And variables like work variety can be adjusted by redesigning the job. Personality is fixed, but differs person to person. managers must in the first place select the job holder for the right personal characteristics, for their ability to perform in the job. That done, they can play with the variables that are under their control and make sure the employee does indeed perform. 5.2.4 Focus on outcomes. Ultimately, the manager is looking for outcomes. Initially, outcomes personal to the employee, and then, when all work is aggregated, outcomes for the firm. Outcomes for the firm are typically performance indicators like turnover, profit, productivity, quality, safety, and staff well-being. Sometimes, despite individual performance, outcomes just don't happen. Sometimes economic factors preclude turning performance into outcomes. Perhaps the market has just dried up, and no matter what the salesperson does, they simply can't get orders. Likewise, sometimes environmental factors like bureaucracy and budget constraints in the firm prevent outcomes. Management is the continual adjustment of each employee's situation, spanning all the variables discussed above, in pursuit of the desired outcomes. 5.2.5 Specifying outcomes in job descriptions. The job description is possibly the most important document that the manager has at their disposal in managing people. Managers must ensure that they define an outcome for each of the accountabilities or responsibilities in the job description. An example might be the development of a market to achieve sales values agreed from time to time. Another might be the obvious requirement to deliver projects on time and to budget. Every accountability or responsibility should have an associated outcome as a measure. 5.2.6 Specifying outcomes in objectives. Accountabilities, complete with their outcome expectations, are generic. Sales targets will be agreed from time to time. Projects will be expected to be done to budget. But nowhere in the job description is the target number. Specific targets and the like are agreed as objectives throughout the year, and certainly annually or more frequently at the performance review. Specific targets will differ year by year. Outcomes, as a measure of performance, are fundamentally difficult to specify and even more difficult to measure. Take setting and assessing objectives for a waiter. The obvious measure is the takings from the tables served. But some tables will be more lucrative than others, so the manager will need to be careful to divide out the tables equitably. Perhaps that's done, but then what happens if one waiter is busy? Does the other waiter say, filling in for colleagues is not part of my job? Therefore, reduce the overall restaurant service quality. This simple example can be chased to a very unsatisfactory conclusion where objectives lead to undesirable outcomes. Determining and assessing that all-important performance is complicated, and we discuss it further in Chapter 6. Section 5.3 Job Design. 5.3.1 Jobs in Firms. A job is a set of accountabilities that an employee has for achieving personal outcomes. If those personal outcomes, achieved by several employees, aggregate, the firm will achieve its desired corporate outcomes. An entrepreneur knows what it's like to wear many hats, developing exciting solutions to customer problems, promoting products and services, pitching for business, building the deliverables, implementing systems on site, supporting them as the customer uses them, chasing payments and paying suppliers. Simply, the smaller the firm, the more roles a job holder takes on. As the firm grows, so the job holders specialize, and the number of roles played reduces as the job holders focus. But the concept is still sound. A small number of roles aggregate to yield a job. Given the total number of roles across a firm, those roles can be constructed and reconstructed in various ways. Jobs can be designed and redesigned in pursuit of task variety, work identity, autonomy, job significance, and available feedback. In a firm with 20 different jobs, there may be over 100 roles, giving plenty of scope to build the company as the manager wants. There are many tools available to conduct job design, but first the manager must create a model of the firm. The concept model outlined in Chapter 1 is useful here again. This model, Figure 5.3, shows the various roles. It's a very simple example, and the model can be elaborated to illustrate the huge complexity of any firm, and with that, the huge number of roles amalgamating to several designed jobs. As we note in Chapter 1, first, the manager must determine what's to be done. Then they must determine the necessary roles, and then aggregate the roles to jobs. It's a top-down approach. 5.3.2. What people look for in a job. It's maybe too simple to just reiterate that staff seek task variety, work identity, autonomy, job significance, and available feedback, because that's what will motivate them. Typically, people look first to do challenging and interesting work. Then they seek a reasonable work-life balance. Many staff train for several years, with 50% of the United Kingdom population today attending university and others undertaking lengthy apprenticeships. It's no surprise, therefore, to learn that they expect to use what they've learned and to continue to be supported in their personal development as their career progresses. When they come into work, they also expect to be treated well and to be valued by their manager. And young people seek to do work of some value to society. These expectations or requirements won't motivate, but if absent, or their converse is present, they'll certainly demotivate, acting to destroy the psychological contract, the unwritten set of expectations held by both manager and employee. 5.3.3. What makes a satisfying job? Job satisfaction comes about first when a person does a job where the characteristics of the job and their needs are in harmony. This emphasizes the obligation on the manager to select the person well for the job, and we discuss how that should be done in Chapter 3. Job satisfaction also occurs when an employee performs well against personal expectations and objectives, and they gain a feeling of meaningfulness from that. People work to build and achieve a sense of meaning in their lives. Job satisfaction enhances engagement in that job in a reinforcing cycle. The more satisfied they are, the better they perform, so the more satisfied they become. Work engagement is discussed further in 5.6. 5.3.4. Job crafting. However good a manager is at job design, and no matter how closely supervised an employee is, they will always be able to be at least a little creative with exactly what work they do. In extreme cases, some employees have a job description that says one thing, and in practice they do something else. This drift between what's written and what's done is termed job crafting, expressing how the job is crafted over time by the job holder, generally to their own benefit and to suit them. Exactly how much job crafting occurs depends pretty much on the manager. If the manager takes no action when the job done evolves or drifts, it's likely to keep on evolving until it's as the job holder wants. And whether or not that's a problem is for the manager to judge. 5.4. Commitment. 5.4.1. What is commitment? Commitment is the psychological state existing within an employee that causes them to attach to their organization. Those committed make open or private promises to continue to provide their labor for the benefits of the organization. Several researchers have deconstructed commitment as a variable. Possibly the most useful idea is that commitment is formed of three factors: affective, continuance, and normative commitment. Under affective commitment, an employee wants to stay. Under continuous commitment, they need to stay. And under normative commitment, they are obliged to stay. Clearly, it's affective commitment that's the prize to be won. Commitment, then, is about wanting to be with a firm. It says nothing directly about enhanced motivation, behaviour, and job performance. 5.4.2. Why commitment is important. By attaching to and intending to stay with the firm, the employee makes other management intervention possible, and this in turn influences performance. There is therefore an important indirect link between commitment to the firm and performance. Commitment must first be won by the manager. Other things then follow. 5.4.3 Determinants of commitment. If the conditions of the contract of employment between employee and manager meet their needs, employees will commit. Those conditions are expressed in the written contract of employment and implied in the various promises and expectations that the employee comes to understand through various communications. Employee needs are often considered in three forms: attachment, subsistence, and growth. If the firm provides a great social environment and the employees like their manager, the employee's need for attachment to people is satisfied, and that's a good start. Employees need to live adequately, and they'll commit to the firm if the terms of their employment allow them to pay the rent or mortgage, buy a car, and keep their family in adequate comfort. Employees also expect that their employer will sponsor their growth, either by offering them job opportunities or by more formal development. So in essence, commitment is won through the human resource management practices in place in the firm and in use by the manager. Employee behaviours illustrating commitment include willingness to do what's asked, good relationships with the manager and colleagues, making the normal private, financial and family commitments, not performing in job search, and the willingness to accept personal development. 5.4.4 Practical things to get commitment. The start point in winning commitment is to ensure that the right employee is in the right job. Fundamentally, the employee must want to be in the firm doing the job they do rather than somewhere else doing something else. Managers must first recruit and select the right person for each job. The aim should be to maximize the person-environment fit. We discuss recruitment and selection in Chapter 3. Commitment is then built by the manager through their one-to-one relationship with the employee and the management actions that define that relationship. And in the end, if employee commitment does not ensue, despite the manager's best efforts, they might have to question whether they have the right person in the job. Humans respond to giving of valuable items. They respond with commitment. This doesn't mean that the manager should spend their day giving employees gifts. It means that on occasion, when the employee needs flexibility to solve a childcare problem, the manager should be flexible and grant time off. It means that when the employee seeks opportunities such as secondment to another group or permission to head up an improvement project, the manager should grant this. In granting these requests, the manager is showing the value that they place in the employee. The more the employee values the gift, the greater their commitment will be in return. Even the manager saying, "Well done," is a gift. This giving of things of value associated with the job and the receiving of commitment in return is effectively a modification to the implied elements of the contract of employment. Each unique, private and very special request-grant exchange builds employee commitment, and the manager should signal to all employees that they're open to discuss such gifting. 5.4.5 Crass management breaks commitment. Commitment takes time to build and is destroyed in an instant. Employee commitment is sustained through the continual meeting of needs of the employee by the manager, and both parties expect that this state will exist for the foreseeable future. So anything that disrupts this status quo damages commitment. Employees expect that they can plan their future and that of their family based on the present employment. A rumour of redundancies and other discord breaks the implied promise and hence decimates employee commitment. Clearly, managers must manage through times of change, and redundancies are one of the many tools available, but how change is announced and managed is critically important. Giving gifts of value cannot occur every day, or the value placed in them diminishes. So commitment sustains through the expectation that valuable gifting will occur in the future. The employee is motivated to respond with commitment only through further expectations of future reward and the desire to sustain the relationship with their manager. It's clear from this description that commitment is built slowly. It's based on multiple exchanges that build trust between manager and employee. Trust is delicate. Managers build trust by ensuring fair treatment of all their employees and by ensuring that procedural justice is always seen to be done. This places a huge obligation on the manager as controller of the relationship. There are many examples of decisions that managers must get right. To avoid damaging commitment, managers must ensure that wages are awarded objectively to employees. And we discuss pay in Chapter 10. Any promotion must be merit-based. Disciplinaries should be scrupulously fair and procedurally transparent. See Chapter 7 for this. And those all-important gifts of flexibility and development must be different but balanced across all employees. Section 5.5 Motivation. 5.5.1 What is motivation? Motivation is the psychological process that gets employees going, keeps them going, and determines the direction and strength of the effort they apply. It's what causes them to stop and apply their energies elsewhere. It's often characterized by three dimensions: attention or direction, effort, and persistence. Motivation can't be seen. Its presence can only be surmised by observing the resultant behavior and performance. Substantially, employees are motivated by the jobs they do and the context of these jobs. As figure 5.4 illustrates, if there's motivation, there's likely to be behavior. Given the right behavior, performance is possible. Motivation, behavior, and performance then lead to the desirable business outcomes like turnover and profit. Motivation sits between the job a person does and the behavior they exhibit, and it's influenced by leadership and the environment or culture in which the work is done. Motivation drives choice. The employee can choose to allocate some or all of their personal resources to any task. The manager's job is to create conditions such that the employee will choose to allocate the resources needed for the work in hand. 5.5.2 About motives and motivators. Often managers say they want to hire motivated people. Given that motivation is a function of job, leadership, and environment within the firm, this is a fundamentally misplaced aim. It's impossible to hire someone who is motivated to a job they've yet to experience. Those managers likely want a person whose motives are in line with the job and firm. Psychologists consider that there are two types of motive: intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motives can be thought of as personal drivers developed in early childhood that act on a person's unconscious mind. Extrinsic motives can be thought of as drivers constructed through interaction with others. Extrinsic motives evolve and change and act in a person's conscious mind. Motives practically manifest in the person as needs, values, orientations, preferences, attitudes, and beliefs, and we discuss these in Chapter 3. 5.5.3 About motivators and demotivators. Like leadership, the question the manager must ask is simple: what do I have to do to influence the motivation of this employee? The answer, other than making sure that their job has high motivating potential and that the culture in the organization is right, is to launch one or more interventions in search of the required performance. There are several theories associated with intervention that help managers understand what they might do. Firstly, there's pay. Pay itself is not a motivator. Employees don't put more effort in return for their normal pay, and any motivating effect of a pay rise soon wears off. Lack of pay and perceived lack of justice around pay decisions are demotivators. Additional payment can be offered on condition of performance. The amount of money offered in return for achievement of outcomes must be considerable to reflect the low perceived chance of earning it, given the large number of confounding factors. In deriving its motivational effects, employees will make actuarial computations. Research suggests that the unfactored sum should be over 30% of normal pay to have any motivational effect. Performance-related pay is shunned by most managers because it encourages antisocial, isolationist behaviours. We deal more with this in Chapter 10. Secondly, there are the needs theories. Those hold that a need influences an employee's motivation until satisfied. The manager has the power to satisfy needs by directing work resources. Examples include the need for employees to hold power over colleagues, achieve great outcomes, or be affiliated with certain work groups. The manager must identify the need in each employee and set the conditions such that each employee will strive until their individual needs are satisfied. Needs are measured by their strength. And thirdly, there are a set of theories around goal setting. Since this is the single most useful area of theory, we dedicate Chapter 6 to this and its associated management practices. 5.5.4 Managing Unmotivated Employees. Managers lament employees who, from their perspective, won't get motivated. Let's assume first that the employee is in a motivating job. Let's assume too that there are no downstream issues associated with their behaviour and performance which might be thwarting outcomes. Let's also assume that the employee experiences good leadership and works in a favourable culture. We're now focusing only on motivation and its independent variables. Motivational variables come in two forms, those like explicit motives and growth need strength that the manager can tap by intervening in the job environment, and those like personality and implicit motives that the manager can do little about. Perceived abilities sits in both camps and can be strengthened with positive work experience. Growth need strength, or GNS, is hugely significant. The strength of the need for personal growth varies person by person. Some people have high growth need strength and others low. Generally, those with high GNS will be keen to grasp developmental opportunities and will be motivated by them. Those low in GNS will likely be motivated by opportunities for achievement and associated rewards. Managers need to assess employees' GNS and choose appropriate interventions. And finally, managers need to recognize that there's often significant conflict between intrinsic and extrinsic motives, with employees perhaps driven one way by needs or intrinsic motives, and the other way by norms or extrinsic motives. Employees overcome such conflict using what's called volitional control, perhaps overcoming subconscious feelings with rational thought. Section 5.6 Engagement. 5.6.1 What is engagement? Engagement is sometimes referred to as supermotivation. To use the dictionary definition of engagement and the metaphor of cogs, it's when an employee meshes completely with the job they do. As a topic of academic study, engagement is relatively new, though managers have used the term commonly for many years. Engagement is conceptually confused with commitment and motivation. Here we drive a deliberate wedge between the three. Commitment comes about from the way an employee is treated by their firm and is described by their need or desire to work there. Commitment makes other management action possible. Motivation comes primarily from the job the employee does and leads to performance, see figure 5.4. And engagement stems from the performance-related learning and achievement and leads to high energy input, dedication and absorption in the job. There is a strict hierarchy from commitment through motivation to engagement. As such, some managers would argue that engagement, as supermotivation, is not always necessary. They would argue that managers need only achieve engagement for employees in jobs with high physical, cognitive, and emotional demand. 5.6.2 How engagement fits in the performance model. Figure 5.5 illustrates how engagement comes about. Performance in the job causes increased learning and heightened feelings of achievement. Learning from performance and outcomes taps implicit motives, which increases motivation and striving in a reinforcing loop. Achievement of outcomes in turn taps explicit motives, which further enhances motivation, again in a reinforcing loop. Engagement is further enhanced by social interaction from, for example, membership of elite groups, and managers can positively influence here by arranging social support from themselves and work colleagues. 5.6.3 Why engagement is important. Managers generally agree that engagement is useful. It describes a striving for performance, for contribution, and inspiration, and few managers would object to employees exhibiting such super motivation. But many might ask whether engagement is needed in all employees, and if those benefits outweigh the cost in management time. There are a few studies that illustrate a direct relationship between the state of engagement and performance, but most academics would argue that this link is subtler. Studies have indicated moderate to strong positive relationships between work engagement and innovativeness, proactivity, initiative-taking, well-being, exhibiting discretionary behaviours, enthusiasm for work, and a host of other beneficial outcomes for manager and employee. Engagement has been shown to have application in balancing challenging work demand with ever-improving personal and work-related resources. These stem from the continual learning and achievement that form the core of engagement. Engagement therefore works to counter stress and burnout. Though in Chapter 10, we look at how engagement itself can result in burnout. 5.6.4 Practical things to do to get engagement. The argument so far indicates that engagement follows commitment and motivation. So to move towards employee engagement, the manager's systems for building commitment and for motivating their staff must be effective. The motivating potential of the employee's job must be high, since it's the job that is the source of super motivation. Optimizing job and job holders start with getting the right person in the right job, and hence engagement starts at job design and places a heavy onus on recruitment and selection. The competencies of the employee must match the demands of the job, and there must be high person-environment fit. Fundamentally, the job holder must feel a huge attachment to what they do. Finally, the values of the manager, the firm, and the employee must all be in harmony. 5.6.5 Assessing engagement. There are two reasonably well-regarded inventories that assess engagement, the Gallup Q12 and the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. The Gallup Q12 focuses on resources, while the US seeks to assess vigour, dedication, and absorption in the work. Practically, managers can sense engagement through evidence of employee behaviours like initiative-taking, attention, questioning, and positive emotions. Section 5.7 Culture. So what is culture? Culture can be summed up as the way we do things around here. It's the undocumented but ever-present pressures that go to influence employees in their work. Employees and managers work within the work culture. Their behaviour is, to a large extent, determined and controlled by that culture, and to some greater or lesser degree, they influence the culture by their presence in it. Since the manager has executive power, they can manipulate the culture by launching interventions. Employees will react to those interventions with modified behaviours, attitudes, beliefs, values, symbolism, behaviours, ideas, and other products of management action. Such changes go to influence employees and will influence managers in subsequent behaviour in a cyclical system that is ever-changing. The way we do things, therefore, evolves. Each employee will also be immersed in other cultures such as that existing at home and in religious, political and social groups. The cultural impact on each employee is therefore multifaceted, and the work culture is the result of pressures from many discrete cultures. There are, of course, major threads. Whole firms can be directed through culture to be highly customer-oriented, and others can become very conservative and staid. Commentators report daily on firms' cultural styles, holding some up as the new way that all firms should be. Cultures can also collide. Asking employees to take responsibility as individuals and to make personal decisions at work can collide with a home or societal pressure to share responsibility and decide collectively. The result is likely personal conflict and observed underperformance in the job. So work culture is complex, but it can be moulded over time to fit business objectives. 5.7.2 Culture and the Trading Firm. Firms trade. Some trade internationally. As a result of this trade, employees will experience the culture in their customers, suppliers, and partners' organizations. This will apply particularly to sales staff and those involved in product and service delivery who encounter customer, supplier, and partner staff. It will also apply to engineers, scientists, and other professionals collaborating within an industry. Whereas those other organizations are in different countries, their national culture will have a significant impact on the interactions. The way employees in those organizations do things may be very different. Culture is most significant in interactions when employees want to influence customer, supplier, and partner staff towards their point of view. 5.7.3 Assessing National Culture. Probably the best national culture model today is that proposed by Geert Hofstede. The essence of Hofstede's model is that nations are defined by people, and people have common characteristics that determine their behaviours, attitudes, beliefs, values, symbolism, and ideas. The result is 114 unique national cultures. Hofstede's model has 6 dimensions: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. 5.7.4 Expressing Organizational Culture. Hofstede has collaborated with others to build an organizational culture model, and this is illustrated in figure 5.6. In this model, the dimensions have 2 poles, shown as labels right and left above. The positions of the lozenges between the polar extremes, marked with the dimensions D1 through to D6, is a set for an organizational culture optimized for innovation. As the model shows, organizations can be described as means-oriented versus goal-oriented, internally driven versus externally or customer-driven, and so on. This culture model can be used with its associated questionnaire to assess extant culture and make plans for initiatives to change to some more desirable culture. 5.7.5 Managing Culture. To succeed in managing culture, the manager needs to build their cultural intelligence. There are 3 essentials. The first essential is knowledge of culture, of how it manifests, and the beliefs and traditions that can exist. The manager also needs a model for building and expressing their understanding of the culture in which they find themselves, such as that described in 5.7.4. The second essential is a mindfulness of culture and an ability to tune in to the surroundings and the firm. This starts with the basic acknowledgement that there is such a thing as culture, that culture in the firm is unique and that it is built from many parts. Sensing can be learned so long as the manager is open to that learning. Finally, the manager needs to build a basket of interventions and the ability to choose an appropriate intervention to suit the culture in hand and the culture change desired. Section 5.8 Emotions. 5.8.1 Understanding Emotions. Emotions are responses to events that, unless regulated, cause behaviour. That behaviour could be desirable or undesirable. Managers must understand emotion in order to control it and to use it as a tool to understand and influence employees. The model in Figure 5.7 is taken from Freya's Law of Emotion. It's a process model illustrating in-person activities, read left to right. Firm lines show causality, dashed lines show control. And it works like this. An employee sees or hears or feels some event. They appraise it. They think about it. The flow of thought enters their emotion center. Emotions have three parts: action readiness, affect, that is, liking and disliking, and arousal. If the event arouses feeling, and if that feeling is strong enough, and the person is awake enough to act, they may exhibit a reaction, a behaviour. Whether or not a reaction results also depends on the person's regulation processes. 5.8.2 How emotions work. Emotions are perhaps best understood by example. Let's consider the case where an employee gets angry and out of hand in a meeting. An event has obviously occurred about which the employee has concerns. They care about the topic, it matters to them. It could be that their reputation has been challenged, or they could be victim to some injustice, or about to become a victim. The employee appraises the situation. They may become aroused, feel dislike, and ready for action. Whether they act depends much on their repertoire of possible actions and their ability to regulate their behaviour. That in turn depends on the employee's mood at the time of the event. 5.8.3 The Laws of Emotion. Freya went on to describe a series of laws to aid understanding of how subjects would act once in the model. His law of closure suggests that when the emotion process triggers, the employee exists within closed walls. It may be difficult for them to put the event in any larger context to allow them to appraise it as less significant. In the example, this instantly suggests that stopping the meeting might be a valid strategy. The employee and the manager who will work with the employee can move out of the meeting context to begin recovery. The fact that the employee is already angry negates any action at the front end of the process. The law of situational meaning and the law of concern will already have clicked in. The employee cares about something of significant meaning. An emotive's been triggered. Some sensibility has been inflamed. Humans react and exhibit some emotional behaviour when the differences between their normal state and aroused state become sufficiently great. This is governed by the law of comparative feeling. But the employee in this case has already reacted. They believe that the event is significant, and the law of comparative reality suggests the event is real, even if it's a rumour or just imagined by the employee. Now to action. The law of conservation of emotional momentum suggests that emotion will persist indefinitely unless counteracted by exposure to other events that permit extinction. So to do nothing is not an option. The manager must act to create another event of significant meaning to replace the first. We must believe that the employee is aware of what they're doing. The law of care of consequence suggests that every emotional impulse elicits a secondary impulse that tends to modify the behaviour considering possible consequence. The employee will be concerned about what happens because they got angry and exhibited antisocial behaviour. It's eminently possible to change the behaviour through some new event, like an expression of empathy with the employee. Perhaps the first words from the manager in getting the employee out of the meeting should be, "I understand how you feel." Adding all of these together, the manager must now create an event that permits the employee to suffer minimal emotional load and encourage the employee to view the situation in another way, one that allows maximum emotional gain. The manager must get the employee alone and suggest an alternative meaning to the events. The manager must break the closed walls of the event, allowing it to be interpreted in a bigger context. The key thing is that the employee's regulation processes must be strengthened, such that the meeting can resume without danger of repetition of the behaviour. Incorrect beliefs and assumptions must be corrected, and the employee must be encouraged to cope. 5.8.4 Managing Emotions. Managers can learn to manage emotions in themselves and others. They can build their emotional intelligence. They can control extant behaviour and trigger new desired behaviours. There are 3 requirements for this. First, the manager must understand the fundamental principles of emotion, illustrated in 581, 582. Second, the manager needs to practice mindfulness, the ability to pay attention in a reflective and creative way to emotional cues in situations encountered. Third, based on understanding and mindfulness, the manager must build the necessary behavioural skills and become competent in managing emotions across a wide range of situations. These skills involve choosing, where necessary, the appropriate event or counter-event to change the path or start a new path through the process. Doing this will realise a different or other more desirable behaviour. Section 5.9 Power. 5.9.1 Defining Power. In Chapter 1, we saw how the entrepreneur appoints an agent, a manager. The manager wields the entrepreneur's power to cause action in the firm. Power over employees comes from the manager's ability to determine their welfare, satisfying their existence, affiliation, and growth needs for the foreseeable future. Power allows the manager to persuade staff to do the manager's bidding, to order them, to make them do, particularly since they might otherwise do something else. In becoming an employee, we noted that the supplier comes indoors and submits to the will of the manager in return for a wage. It's a voluntary arrangement. It's an exchange, a contract that can be broken in an instant by either party. Power is therefore fragile, a delicate tool to be used with great care and precision. In Chapter 2, we illustrated that leadership is a lot about facilitation, about setting goals and helping employees meet those goals. It's about coaching from a proximal position rather than commanding from a distance. Management is about taking responsibility for the actions of employees and guiding them to success rather than simply blaming them for failure. We saw also that a directive leadership style can be useful, but mostly successful leaders use the subtler non-directive form. 5.9.2 Exploiting Power. How that ordering is done is all important. Those who use social skills to work with rather than boss around enjoy greater success. For some, being a social manager comes naturally. For others, it can be learned. How managers exploit power has a huge implication for companies. In managing manager selection, succession planning, and manager development, and in the function of management teams. The way in which managers exploit power influences the culture of the organization, itself an antecedent for higher-level concepts, like the way the organization learns and the way staff innovate new ideas and products. We hear much about the abuse of power in big organizations, but it's not just in big organizations that issues arise in the way managers exploit power. Managers are typically recruited for their psychological need for power. It's common for boards to recruit the alpha wolf, male or female. Somehow naturally, alphas like the idea of appointing other alphas to act in their stead. They feel someone who will kick ass is to be trusted, where someone who will sympathetically work with other managers and staff is somehow a higher risk. But all who might excel as manager typically have a high psychological need for power. 5.9.3 Forms of Power. Research done over the past 30 years or so suggests that power has 2 discrete forms. Personalized power, or P power, is the need to set and meet personal goals. Those high in P power have a need to feed their own egos. They focus on the I and see that they are in competition with others in a zero-sum game in which they aim to win while others lose. Those high in P power are the alphas. For them, success breeds success and an even greater need for personal enhancement to fuel that power. For them, success is the growing fiefdom, the enlarged sphere of domination, and the bigger I. Socialized power, S-power, on the other hand, is the need to derive power through others and for others. It's the desire to use power for the wider benefit. Those high in S-power tend to put the needs of their organization above their own personal needs, something that is well established as a fundamental need of a good manager. Teachers and nurses tend to be high in S-power. They need to command, but not for themselves alone. And women generally tend to be S-power dominant. 5.9.4 Power Dominance. There's a balance in each person. Some people are dominant in P-power. Research has found, for example, that those high in P-power do drive huge change, but often the resulting organization does not enjoy ongoing stability. National leaders in P-power, or high in P-power, are also more likely to take their countries to war. Others are dominant in S-power, and that's not to say that this latter group would not take their countries to war. It's just that they'd build a coalition, a consensus for action, rather than giving an executive order. This balance between S-power and P-power is not a measure of competitiveness, though. Whilst women are typically higher in S-power than P-power, they're just as competitive as men. People can be both highly competitive and dominant in S-power. It's just that in S-power, winning is done with others rather than over others. So everyone has both P and S. How each person behaves depends on which is dominant. 5.9.5 S-power benefits. Research over the years shows that the use of socialized power is related to effectiveness as a manager. Indeed, it also suggests the converse, that personalized power managers have many undesirable characteristics. P-power managers are, for example, impulsive, and as one commentator noted, not disciplined enough to be good institution builders. So for excellence in the management task, managers need to use socialized power. They need to be inclined to build alliances, networks, coalitions, or groups to get things done. In turn, they need self-control. They must be able to inhibit personal ego, needs, and desires in favor of the needs of the organization. 5.9.6 Turning from the dark side. Arguably, the preference for S over P and the ability to use S power effectively is a form of crystallized intelligence learned throughout life. Firms developing young employees to exploit S power would therefore be wise to start early and discourage the use of personalized power when appraising and coaching. Whether someone is low in the personality of trait of empathy and high in the need for personalized power can ever shun the dark side for power is a moot point. Certainly being trained to see the values of S power and learning the techniques of alliance, network, coalition and team building is a start. Behaviour change will then need significant coaching to dump the narcissistic ways. Section 5.10 Groups. In Chapter 1, we discuss how a contract evolves from one between an entrepreneur and their suppliers to become one between a firm and its employees. It's for the manager to decide the best way to organize those employees. Groups naturally form in society to get things done, and firms have likewise found that having employees work in groups is useful to facilitate the business endeavor. This section discusses how groups function. When discussing groups, there's significant overlap with leadership and management discussed earlier in this chapter and in Chapter 2. 5.10.1 About teams and groups. Many managers talk synonymously about groups and teams. There's a huge difference in the manager and member energy needed to build and sustain each, and so definitions are essential. A team is a small, closely knit collection of individuals who train and perform together. The emphasis here is on training. A team likely trains more than it performs. There are a host of examples of teams: a fire station watch, a football team, a special forces patrol. A team trains so hard together that they learn one another's characteristics, needs, preferences, and personalities. They learn to second-guess one another because typically they're involved in routine but high-intensity work. Each knows the next step in the process. Each is looking out for, protecting, and helping the team members. The team performance and outcomes reign supreme over personal performance or gain. But the cost of building and maintaining a team is huge. Most managers would agree they don't need teams. They need functioning, effective, cooperative employees working in groups to provide mutual support. The emphasis here is on cooperation. Group members need to build mutual trust by being reliable colleagues. Each needs to be competent in their own job, and each needs to communicate well, express meaning, and work through difficulties. 5.10.2 Forming groups for work. Unlike social groups that form to make society function, work groups have a very specific purpose defined by the manager. A small firm will comprise a single group. Managers will divide supergroups into smaller groups and subgroups as the firm grows. There's a useful 5-word sequence that describes a group life cycle: forming, storming, norming, performing, and disbanding. Storming describes the phase after formation, when the group members sort out their issues and begin to develop the trust needed to become cooperative colleagues. Norming describes when they cease to be a plurality of individuals and gel to establish norms of behaviour in pursuit of common goals. After the initial shakedown, the group performs until a time when the manager has no further use for the group in its extant form, and they disband it. Most managers inherit ready-formed groups that are already well into the performing phase. Many groups will have problems caused by difficulties in their storming and norming phases. Many groups will be plagued by leavers and joiners interrupting group process. And many managers will be struggling to subdivide and reform groups to meet new purposes. Group organisation in firms is dynamic. There are 4 key requirements in building groups. Firstly, group members should be competent in their jobs. Secondly, members should be encouraged to cooperate rather than compete. Thirdly, members should stimulate one another such that their collective effort is greater than the sum of their individual efforts. And fourthly, the manager as group leader should deliberately orchestrate group outcomes by intervening in group activities. 5.10.3 Basic ideas about people in groups. To be a group, members must interact. Interaction ideally requires a face-to-face presence. This is simple when co-located and working the same hours, but difficult when group members work remotely, perhaps across time zones. The value of the group is twofold. Firstly, each member finds value in membership and is in turn influenced by the group towards group behaviour norms. Value for the member comes from the basic human desire to join, to not be left isolated. A group member will stay a member, physically and metaphorically, for as long as their affiliation needs are being met. Secondly, each member is supported technically and emotionally in their endeavours by other group members. It's for the manager, therefore, to appoint the right members and engineer the right behavioural norms through the introduction of useful work processes and periodic interventions. The manager's aim here is to have the group outcomes exceed the outcomes that would otherwise be realised by a plurality of individuals, each with a dyadic relationship with the manager. Inevitably, members form opinions about one another. Members also form opinions about their own position in the group, and they work to optimise that position. They engage in exchange and as a result grow to trust one another. The more they exchange and the greater value of the objects of that exchange, the greater value placed in the intra-group relationships. Groups develop, they evolve, relationships between group members change, trust grows and is sometimes broken. Change comes through pressure from the environment outside the group, and from leavers and joiners and from manager interventions. Over time, those group behaviour norms form a group culture or climate, and each group becomes an identifiable entity simply because of its members and their interaction. 5.10.4 Employees as cooperative colleagues. To realise the benefits of groups, managers need group members to cooperate. Ultimately, they need group members to be reliable. When one member says they'll do something for another, that's a commitment and must happen, or the group function is damaged, and with that, future group outcomes. Managers can build members to be trusted colleagues by teaching the idea of a contract as an exchange. The intergroup process works like this. Where one member asks another for help, the requestor must set out what's needed and by when. The requestee has the right to negotiate. It may be that only half of the activity can be completed in the time, or it may be that some other commitment that the requestee has already made to another member prevents accepting this new contract, and the request is impossible given the current resources. In this latter case, perhaps the manager must be asked to adjudicate. Ultimately, the negotiation leads to a deal that is acceptable to both parties, a compromise. The requestor accepts because they need help, and the requestee accepts because they expect to likewise need help in the future. Each member has multiple contracts forming and maturing with every other member in the group. This inter-member contracting works for co-located members and is even more important when members are dislocated in time and space. Contracting works worldwide, mediated by electronic communications, to build trust in international project teams. But here's the rub. As the requested activity proceeds, any risk to the contract must cause the two members to meet again. They must discuss how the integrity of the contract is to be maintained. It's no use waiting until the day of delivery to announce that what was agreed was impossible anyway. Section 5.11. Bias. Day-to-day management is not a perfect activity. Managers must learn to recognize that imperfection, using methods and tools to moderate the errors that would otherwise be inherent in their decisions. Often those errors come from the manager's personal biases. Those biases are manifold, and we describe below how they manifest and how they can, at least to some extent, be overcome. 5.11.1. Defining bias. All managers would hope that they make rational decisions. All would hope that they will conduct their day-to-day activities considering only assessments, ideas and plans that are developed because of critical thinking duly supported by evidence. The reality is a long way from this. Most managers make decisions using a mix of gut feel and repetition from experience based on evidence from hearsay. The result is that managers' decisions are open to the effects of bias. Bias is best explained by comparing real decision-making with ideal decision-making. Ideal decision-making would always return the same result for a given scenario, independent of the person making the decision. So under ideal decision-making, 1,000 managers randomly distributed across the globe would all make the same decision, given the same scenario and information. Those managers would be a mix of women and men, young and old, white and non-white, engineers and sociologists, and all variants between and many more besides. They would be completely objective, making their decision using the same psychological processing engine, considering evidence alone. But each decision maker brings their different upbringing, education, and experience to the task, modified in turn by their identities, attitudes, beliefs, and values. Their cognitive assessments would not all be the same. The result would be 1,000 different decisions. Some of those decisions might coalesce towards various normative forms. Culture might account for some of this. All managers in Japan, for example, might think similarly about a given scenario and make similar decisions. And all managers who had a UK public schooling might likewise have similar ideas, resulting in similar decisions. But there would be more differences than similarities. Bias is an idiosyncratic effect and must be understood, assessed, and countered personally. Bias, or rather being biased, is a term we use to describe the fact that everyone interprets and processes information differently, and hence everyone comes to different conclusions about each scenario faced. In principle, bias doesn't matter. One could just conclude that the differing conclusions and outcomes are part of the so-called rich tapestry of life. But it does matter, often because of the result of flawed decision-making, people get harmed. As a result of bias, a manager might discriminate between a white person and a non-white person. The white person might get promotion, while the other person gets poor quality work. As a result of bias, employees might bully a gay man to the point where he commits suicide. The likelihood and effect of hurtful outcomes varies. And bias is a serious societal problem. 5.11.2 Countering bias. As we suggest, bias is individual, and hence it must be dealt with individually. No quick introduction of process or new technology will counter bias. It might be useful to recruit blind, ignoring names, genders, and ages on CVs, but in the end, such tactics only mask the problem rather than overcome it. No technology or process can root out bias. Indeed, potentially, the presence of technology to control bias itself introduces bias. Fundamentally, managers must change their worldview. They must unlearn their biased ways and learn to interpret and process data objectively, and that's hugely difficult. Bias training, leading ultimately to objective decision-making, is best done in 3 parts. First, the manager must understand how bias works and the huge range of resulting effects from it. We discuss this and illustrate the scope below in a diagram. This understanding will take time to achieve, requiring significant reading and reflection. During this period, the manager must form a view about what objective decision-making is for them and how they will tell an objective decision from a biased one. Second, the manager must practice mindfulness. They must stop themselves at the start of every possible decision and ask, how can I be objective about the data I'm presented with and the way that I'm going to process it? And they must trap their own bias by writing down where they could go wrong and the undesirable effects bias might cause. Third, the manager must introduce criteria, process, and technology. Objective decision-making requires criteria. Criteria are principles or standards against which something can be judged. Criteria must be valid. Validity demands that each criterion helps predict a desirable business outcome, such as performance, quality, or safety. We might, for example, say that someone with high abstract reasoning will perform well in a scientific job, and we'd use abstract reasoning as one of our decision-making criteria in personnel selection and development. That claim is well supported by evidence from publicly available academic research. Whether an applicant is black or white, male or female, gay or straight is irrelevant when it comes to personal performance in that job. To introduce bias would corrupt the decision by introducing a non-valid criterion. In our example, it only matters that they have high abstract reasoning. Managers must ask themselves every minute of every day what criteria they will use to make the decision before them. Managers must build libraries of criteria for every decision they make, and it's here that process and technology help. There are many, many tools available. We discuss the various tools, processes, and technologies in other sections. Indeed, this entire book focuses on objective, evidence-based decision-making using valid criteria. But in the end, all decisions will be biased, even if only slightly. With personal development and the use of tools, however, the decisions will be less outlandish, less extreme, and more objective, and managers and their staff will be more aware of the risks they run as a result of bias. 5.11.3 Examples of bias. The problem with bias and the countering of biases is that there are simply too many identifiable biases to remember. Benson and Manoogian have developed the Cognitive Bias Codex, grouping over 200 biases into 20 categories, and in turn into 4 families. But even that doesn't help. And in line with our biases as authors, we've simplified these to give figure 5.8. To avoid information overload, this graphic sets out the biases in 20 categories. describing the categories as an action acting on an object. As an example, we see the bias category simplifying to make consumption easier at the 5 o'clock position. Under this example category, there are 9 individual identifiable biases, like zero-sum bias. Under zero-sum bias, a person would assume that for someone to gain, someone else must lose. The person's worldview expressed as a bias prevents them from accepting that both parties could gain or lose as a result of a decision. Each category covers between 3 and 21 discrete biases. And obviously space precludes us describing all biases. We give a reference to the Cognitive Bias Codex, in which all biases are described in the bibliography. 5.11.4 Typical Manager Bias. It's hugely difficult to select biases that might be typical of managers. We consider the following 4 to be useful as examples. Frequency illusion. Once an event is noticed, it seems to repeat. Once it's noticed that someone's off sick, they seem to be off sick again and again. They're not off sick often, it just seems that way. Confirmation bias. Managers tend to interpret what they see in a way that supports their prior belief. Having had a great female marketing manager in a previous company, for example, the belief is that no male will be as good in that role. Stereotyping. Managers tend to bundle people into types and form generalized opinions based on superficial observation. An assumption is, for example, that because one engineer is judgmental, jumps quickly to conclusions, all engineers will be likewise judgmental. And primacy effect. People tend to remember things cited at the beginning of a list of items better than things lost in the middle. This applies to many written and verbal lists in documents like CVs and disciplinary investigation reports. It's futile for a manager to try to remember all forms of bias and then to scan that list at every decision. As we note above, it's better to understand how to make a rational decision in the first place, based on suitable criteria and evidence. But it is important that all managers read about all 200 plus biases to recognize the scope and the depth of bias in their day-to-day lives and its possible effects. 5.11.5 Prejudice. Above we discussed bias as if all 200 biases were equally probable and of equal effect in each person. Simply, in some people, some biases are more prevalent than others. One of the most prevalent is prejudice. Prejudice fits with the definition above and is one of the simpler biases to understand. Prejudice frequently results in serious harm to victim. The degree of harm that has been suffered by employees and workers over the past years has resulted in statute against prejudice in most countries. There are many examples of prejudice. Prejudice against women, not inviting women to team after-works drinks, making it a man's activity. The result in the company is perhaps promotion of males over females. Prejudice against non-white people, supporting and encouraging white employees, but ignoring other employees, such as those whose ethnicity stems from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. Prejudice against people practicing the Jewish faith, perhaps vociferously claiming that the Holocaust did not happen, causing hurt feelings. In the UK, prejudice has been so ingrained and so damaging to victims that the UK government passed the Equality Act 2010 and set up the Equality and Human Rights Commission to counter it. 5.11.6 Equality. As we've illustrated, cognitive bias is an esoteric, complex, and difficult human psychological problem. And of all, prejudice is possibly the most prevalent and damaging. Equality, or rather inequality, is its frequent outcome. The EHRC commenced activities in 2007 and incorporated the activities of 3 extant organisations: the Commission for Racial Equality, the Disability Rights Commission, and the Equality Opportunities Commission. The EHRC uses its enforcement powers to protect people against serious and systemic abuses of their equality rights and to clarify equality and human rights law. It has also an informing and influencing role to aid compliance with standards. The Equality Act 2010 identifies 9 protected characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. The Act then makes it an offence to discriminate against someone or treat them less favourably than someone else because of any of those characteristics. In employment, the aggrieved party has access to the employment tribunal system for remedy. The question then for managers is whether the government's introduction of a statute solves all issues where managers or employees might be prejudiced against others. This is unlikely, and we recommend again that managers adopt the 3-step approach outlined above, comprising knowledge, awareness and interventions. We recommend this as a general approach to make sure that the need for equality is satisfied. 5.11.7 Gender Inequality. Gender, or sex as the Equality Act calls it, has been the topic of prejudice for centuries. Simply, gender inequality is the social process by which men and women are treated differently. It has its roots in prejudice, but appears in many other biases such as stereotyping, belief bias, and illusory superiority. One significant inequality outcome is in pay, and we discussed this in Chapter 10, and we continue the discussion here. Gender inequality has its roots in society, and there are many elements to the topic. Science, technology, engineering and mathematics, the STEM careers, pay well. But those who might influence career choice, such as schools and parents, tend to persuade girls towards other careers, such as health and social care. Those careers are less well paid. The result is a significant national gender pay gap. There is no biological reason why women are less able in high-paid STEM careers, nor is there any reason why girls find STEM subjects less interesting. It's simply that influencers don't consider it right that bias causes girls to drop the STEM subjects in their early teens. Conversely, society tends to influence boys away from nursing, suggesting that it's insufficiently manly. The result is a huge gender pay gap in hospitals, where we find a very high number of women employed as nurses. The definition of gender pay gap is shown graphically in Figure 5.9. But career choice is not the whole story. Gender inequality exists even when men and women join firms to do the same job. Managers are more often male, and in applying their prejudice and other biases, they favour male employees. As a result, there are many claims of discrimination in the work that women are given and in their speed of promotion. Couples seldom share child-rearing duties equally, despite the existence now of shared parental leave. If they did, both would take equal time off and both would be held back equally from progressing in seniority and salary. Instead, it is very likely that the woman takes more time off, simply because culturally that has always been the way. As a result, child-rearing women slip in seniority when they eventually return to work. Because child-rearing women shoulder the bulk of the child-rearing effort, they are also discriminated against because they are not able to put in the extra hours that are needed to progress. Women typically work their contracted hours, but men work 20 or even 30% more, and that's highly valued by managers when considering promotion. Significant research has shown the value of balance in the number of men and women in work groups, and the value generally of women in a workforce. Research shows that gender inequality is, for many reasons, bad for firms, and managers should strive to overcome the biases that cause it. But it will take many years to correct. Managers can't hope to fix this societal problem overnight. Section 5.12, Chapter Summary. This chapter has dealt with what many would describe as people skills. Unfortunately, often people skills are learned on the job, forgetting or ignoring the science behind the building and maintaining of relationships to secure employee performance. In this chapter, we've introduced much of this theory in the hope that managers can mix theory and practice to build their own management competence. Firstly, we describe a linear feed-forward model of employee performance that starts with the job the employee does. The job motivates and creates behaviour. Behaviour can, all other things being equal, cause performance, and of course, performance leads to achievement of outcomes. If only it were that simple. For performance using the feed-forward model, the manager must set up the right conditions. But as systems engineers would say, this is management operating in open-loop configuration. The manager sets things up and hopes that the employees are suitably motivated, have the right tools, and will perform. But what if they don't? We argue that the manager must make use of feedback. If performance is not achieved, an error message that there's something wrong must trigger corrective action by the manager. We then introduce the feedback control model. Here, the manager observes the performance and measures the outcomes realized. The manager then determines appropriate interventions that will recover the performance and achieve the outcomes desired. The feed-forward and feedback models are fundamental to managing people. Employees in taking a job seek task variety. They expect to make use of all that they've learned, and they expect to be treated with respect. Ultimately, work must give them purpose and meaning. The manager must therefore design the job with all that in mind. If the work and the working conditions that the manager has organised are right, the employee will commit to the firm. Commitment is the first stop on a continuum from commitment through motivation to engagement. There are 3 types of commitment. 2 involve obligation, while 1 involves affect. Managers should seek affective commitment in employees. Emotional commitment in which the employee expresses desire to work for the firm. Affective commitment is for the manager to win. If conditions are right, the job will cause the employee to be motivated. And if the right conditions are in place to enable learning and achievement, supermotivation or engagement can ensue. We argue that supermotivation is not needed in all, but certainly it's essential in key employees. Those forming the kernel of the firm's capability are engaged. The feed-forward model is overly simplistic in assuming a cascade from job through motivation to behaviour and performance. It ignores the environment in which the job and job holder exist. Part of that environment is the culture created by colleagues and managers, and in part by each employee's home life. We discuss the application of models for culture definition in the context of making change to culture, thereby influencing employee motivation. Managers must learn to use emotions in their management lives, and we give a model that allows managers to understand and direct emotions. We discuss also how power plays in the firm, how the manager gets their way. We note the existence of P power and S power, and we suggest that it's S power that managers need in abundance. Then we look at how groups form and contribute to getting things done. We suggest, perhaps controversially, that few firms need teams. All that's needed is cooperation between employees and hence the building of cooperative groups. Employees can learn to contract with one another, thereby becoming reliable colleagues. The extreme effort needed to create teams is unnecessary in all but a few instances. And finally, we discuss the huge topic of bias. We suggest a general model for understanding. We then focus on one of the most common and damaging biases, prejudice. Prejudice results in inequality, so much so that the UK government has implemented statute, the Equality Act 2010, to try to counter it. In the last sections, we set out how one outcome of bias, the gender pay gap, is measured. Gender pay gap reporting is now mandatory for larger firms. In closing, we make the statement that gender inequality is a societal problem. In summary, management is about understanding the mechanisms. What for a given employee will cause performance? Once those variables are known, the manager can start the management engine to sense outcomes and launch interventions to maintain performance to that needed. Using this model, management loses its myth and becomes a science that can be learned by all.